Hello everyone. Welcome to today's session of Landscape Live. I'm Aditi, and along with Yue, we will be moderating today's talk. And before I introduce the speaker, I would just like to list a few house rules for today's talk. The entire seminar will last for about 1 hour. And out of that, we'll have about 30 to 45 minutes of talk, followed by another 15 minutes for questions. We will open the chat for questions towards the end of the talk, and you can type in your questions there, and we can ask a question on your behalf. Or if you would like to ask a question yourself, you can simply unmute yourself and ask a question to the speaker directly. So that's also okay with us. And lastly, we will be recording the talk, and I think the recording is already started. So this talk will then be available on YouTube for everyone to view. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Virginia Ruiz-Villanueva. Dr. Virginia is an assistant professor at the University of Lausanne and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And today she will be talking to us about quantifying and monitoring the transfer and supply of wood in rivers, especially during floods. So thank you for being with us here today, Virginia, and it's all yours. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation. It is a pleasure to contribute to this webinar series today as a speaker. So before I start talking about in-stream large wood, I want to tell what in-stream large wood is. So when a tree falls in a river, like you see in this video from Alaska, it becomes in-stream large wood, and it becomes also an essential part of river ecosystems as the wood influences the river processes, forms, and functions. So in this talk today, I will briefly show you the most relevant biophysical functions of wood in rivers. Then I will focus on the origin and supply processes of wood to rivers, and I will show you how we can quantify and model these processes. Then I will present our monitoring and quantification of wood transport approach and how we quantify and monitor how wood moves in river channels, particularly during floods. And finally, I will talk about the potential impacts and hazards related to the transport of wood during floods, focusing on the interaction between wood and infrastructures. So let's start by explaining why do we care about wood in rivers. So when the wood is deposited in a river, it becomes an important source of flow resistance and energy dissipation, lowering the flow velocity and the transport capacity. The wood accumulations cause the formation of bed forms like bars, pools, and steps, as you see in the sketch on the slide. The wood also enhances channel widening and scour, but may also protect banks from erosion. Wood influences the deposition of sediment and the sediment grain size. And so these effects have an influence on the channel patterns, such as modifying channel width and enhancing the lateral mobility. And at the river scale, wood improves channel floodplain connectivity, increasing overbank inundation. So these effects are not only local and short-term effects, but wood influences processes, forms, and functions across diverse spatial and temporal scales. And as a result of these processes, wood enhances the physical complexity of rivers, increasing biodiversity. But also in-stream large wood forms the base of the organic matter pyramid in aquatic ecosystems. And for certain rivers, in-stream large wood, together with the living standing trees, are the major reservoirs of organic carbon. So the presence of wood influences the water chemistry, temperature, and it provides also a hard substrate for the biofilm to colonize. But wood pieces can be also used by other species, not just aquatic species. as you see in the pictures in the lower part of the slide. So the species that can be attached to the wood might be dispersed, for example, during floods, and then survive the flood, as you see in this video, was taken after a flood in a river in Switzerland, is full of macroinvertebrates. So the interaction between the flow, the sediment, and the wood produces better conditions for these macroinvertebrates, but also fish, and enhancing habitat for many species. Wood supplies food, shelter, spawning, and nursery areas. But wood also influences the establishment and succession of riparian vegetation and the development and evolution of islands. So in summary, wood influences the entire food web, improving the river's biological and ecological diversity. Still, despite the important role of wood in rivers, most of our understanding of rivers is still based on only on the flow and sediment regimes. It is only recently that we started to acknowledge the fundamental influence of vegetation. However, wood is equally important. And together, the three regimes, the flow, the sediment, and the wood, sustain and regulate the river's physical and ecological functions. So like the flow and sediment regimes, the wood regime consists of the wood supply, transport, transfer, and storage. And it can be characterized in terms of frequency, magnitude, and timing. But unlike the sediment flow regime that have been studied for decades or even centuries, much less is known about the natural wood regime. And so only few sites have been monitored, and only single aspects of the wood regime, for example, the storage, are usually quantified if they are quantified at all. So, for example, wood transport remains still very challenging to quantify. And this is because, like sediment, wood is transported during floods, and this makes the monitoring of wood transport very challenging. So data is very scarce. And when we look at the amount of wood that is transported via flood, this is what you see in the graph. So in the y-axis, you have the volume of wood exported or transported during single events, plotted here versus the drainage area. And so what we can see is that the scatter is, or the variability in the graph is very high. And this means that the similar rivers of similar sizes or similar hydraulic conditions, if we take the drainage area as a proxy for this chart, may result in a very wide range of wood transport. And this is because wood dynamics or wood transport is a complex process, and it varies significantly within fluvial systems, as it is controlled by the interaction between the climate, the hydrology, the forest, and the fluvial morphology. So the wood regime provides us a valuable framework to enhance our understanding of rivers in general. But the transported wood may also cause hazards. So it may accumulate at critical sections like bridges, like this video is showing in a flood in New Zealand a couple of years ago. Also the accumulation and eventually the collapse of the structure, of course, may influence the negative effects of the flood. So although it's important to stress that none of the dangers posed by the wood are just inherent to the wood itself, but to the obstacles and infrastructures that are not designed to allow this wood to pass. Then we should also integrate the wood regime into the river and flood hazard assessment. But still, this is very rarely considered. So the very first question that we ask when we see a video showing transport of wood is where does the wood come from and how it is supplied to the river. So in mountain rivers, wood is usually recruited or supplied by landslides, debris flows, and fluvial erosion. And these are very complex processes that show a large spatial and temporal variability, varying from one river to another, and this makes wood supply predictions very challenging. But if we know the areas that are prone to these processes and overlay this with the forest density here in the equation D and A, then we can estimate how much wood the catchment may produce. However, there is no single model that can simulate all of these processes together accurately. So identifying these contributing areas remains challenging. And so what we did was to combine existing high-resolution geospatial information that we have available in Switzerland of areas prone to these processes, so landslides, debris flows, and bank erosion. And we combined this in a GIS environment and applied a fuzzy logic to estimate the wood volumes. And we did this for different frequency magnitude scenarios, from frequent to rare scenarios. So we applied this model to 40 catchments in Switzerland. And in this graph, what you see is the contribution of the wood volume, so the contribution in percentage of each process to the estimated wood volume. And here is just for a selected number of catchments that are sorted by size. So you have the name of the catchment, and in parentheses, the number is the catchment area. So what we see is that for a relatively frequent low magnitude event, the dominant process that supplies wood to rivers was bank erosion, here colored in green. And this was particularly evident for larger catchments. But another observation is that the stored wood in the river, the instream wood that is already available in the river, was a very small part of the supplied wood at the catchment scale. So the importance of debris flows and landslides increased for the low frequency and high magnitude scenario. And this was also particularly so for smaller catchments. So still in larger catchments, only a small proportion of landslides may supply wood during extreme events, and bank erosion remains the dominant process. But this showed clearly that the dominant wood supply process varies according to the catchment size and also the magnitude frequency event. In mountain rivers, we also observed that there are other processes that might be important to supply wood to rivers, like snow avalanches or tree mortalities. So we tried to quantify them as well. So we applied the same model, considering these two processes in one single catchment, and assuming also that avalanches may only happen at low frequency, while tree mortality is a high frequency process. So we compared the estimated volumes provided by these processes and the other processes as well, so landslides, debris flows, and bank erosion. And in these graphs, you see the estimated total volume in cubic meters, but also the contribution of each process to the total wood supply, or the total estimated volume. And so what we could see indeed is that these processes may contribute to more than 20% of the total estimated wood volume. So these are important processes in alpine rivers. Of course, this was a simplified model, so we wanted to validate or to compare with observations. And fortunately, we have a unique database in Switzerland that was compiled after important flood events. So we compared the model results with these estimated volumes after these events. And although in general the model gave us similar values, what we can see is that the model in general overestimated the volume of wood supplied by each catchment. And this is, of course, explained by the fact that the model takes all the areas prone to the different processes and computes the volume in all these areas, while during a single event, only some of these areas will be activated and will supply wood. So in this graph, we plotted the estimated volume of wood versus the catchment area, and the size of the marker shows the error or the difference between the estimated and observed wood volumes. So we clearly see that the larger errors or larger uncertainties were given by the larger or in the larger catchments. So it's in these larger catchments where the estimation or the computation of wood supply remains very challenging. So the problem in larger rivers is that once the wood is being transported and deposited, for example, in lakes or reservoirs, identifying the origin or, for example, the tributary that supplies the wood is very difficult. And this is the case of the wood arriving at the Genesia Dam in the Rhone River in France. So in this dam, in this reservoir, all the wood that is coming from upstream is retained, as you see in the picture. And the dam managers have to remove the wood mechanically. And so all the wood arriving to the dam come from two main tributaries, the Arve and the Valserine. And these two tributaries are very different. So the Valserine drains the Jura Mountains made of limestones, and the catchment is up to 70% forested, while the Arve drains the Mont Blanc Massif in the Alps with crystalline rocks and 6% of the area glaciated, and is only 40% forested. So when there is a flood, all the wood that arrives to the dam has to be extracted. So the dam managers take this wood, they pile the wood nearby, and then we go and take all the samples we want. And so we look at the wood at different scales. First, we look at the species distribution, because this will give us an idea about the provenance across the riparian buffer. So we know that conifers may come from farther away, while salix willows may come from just nearby the channel. But we also look at the other characteristics of the wood, because the trees record specific characteristics from the environment where they grow. So we apply dendrochronology and dendrochemistry, and we analyze the water-stable isotopes, hydrogen and oxygen, and minor and trace elements in the wood cellulose. And thanks to this, we can distinguish, we can infer the origin of the wood that arrives to the dam. So for example, the isotopic signal of the hydrogen and oxygen, which is linked to the source of the water and the hydrological and climatic conditions where the trees grow, allowed us to distinguish between two major tributaries, so between the Arve and the Valserine. And this was like this because mostly because of the presence of the glacier in the Arve subcatchment, which related to the lower values in the hydrogen isotopic signal. But when we looked at the chemical composition of the wood, this allowed us to zoom in and go much more in detail. And so we could distinguish not even among the two tributaries, but also within different parts along the two subcatchments. And we could infer where the wood that we extracted from the reservoir came from. And when we, so here in the graph, you see the different parts of the two subcatchments. for the reference samples, so the living trees. And when we plotted the samples that we collected in Genesiad, we could infer that most of these samples that were extracted in 2021 came mostly from the lower Arf, but some traveled also very long distances. Some of them, they came from upstream. So once we know where the wood comes from, then we want to understand how it is transported and how much wood will move and how will move. And so to do this, we monitor wood in several rivers. And this is because observations of wood transport, as I said at the beginning, are very scarce. So we do field surveys, we tag and track pieces of wood in different rivers. And as it is done for sediment, we use tags, but also radio frequency transmitters. We also use drones, and we install cameras, and we also use citizen science or home videos from YouTube, for which witnesses of floods record the floods with transport with large wood transported, and then we extract quantitative information from these videos. But we are also installing video cameras, and we are developing a machine learning algorithm to track the wood in the images, as you see in this video. So all this information is very important for understanding better how wood moves in rivers. So one of our monitoring sites is the Spol River in the Swiss National Park. Is near the Italian and Swiss border. And although the river crosses the national park, the river is dammed by 2 dams. And here in the picture, you see the lower one, Ovaspin. And so before the regulation, before the construction of the dams, natural floods were very frequent and seasonal in the river. So it's a snow melt flow regime river, which produces high flows in spring and summer, and very intense summer storms trigger floods in summer and early autumn. So after the construction of the dams, the flow was homogenized throughout the year and reduced up to less than 1 cubic meter per second in winter, which is a very low flow. So because the river crosses the national park, after the regulation, a restoration program started in the year 2000. And this restoration program releases experimental floods every year. And so here you have for the recent period, the past few years, some of the peaks of these floods compared to the residual flow of the river. And so here you also see some of the typical hydrographs of these experimental floods. So the typical hydrograph lasts about 10 hours, and peaks are sustained for 2 hours, and they go up to 25 and sometimes 40 cubic meters per second. So these floods, these experimental floods, offer us a unique opportunity to observe, monitor, and quantify wood transport. And we have been doing this for the past 5 years in the lower part of the river. So this is the ridge downstream from the Ovaspin dam to the confluence with the Inn River. And in this section, in this segment of the river, we have a major tributary, unregulated tributary, which is supplying a lot of sediment and wood to the Spol. So here I will show you results from the past 5 years and the past 5 experimental floods. So after 5 years, we observed that wood entrainment, so the number of pieces that are actually mobilized during these floods is relatively low. And so these are the bars in green. in the graph. So they remain below 20% of the total number of track pieces. Although we have also about 20% of pieces that we couldn't find after the floods. So the actual transport might be even higher than we think. But still, what we can see is that there is a trend in the transport. So there is an increase in the number of pieces that are moving every flood. And then if we group the pieces of wood according to their conditions, so for example, if they are varied or not, if they have roots or not, according to their orientation or the decay state, we also see this trend. So in these graphs, you have always the proportion of pieces classified according to these conditions: varial, roots, orientation, and decay. The colored bars are related to pieces that moved and we could track, so we could find after the floods. And the grayscale bars are pieces that didn't move. So again, we see this trend towards more motion for the recent period. And then we also see that there is more variability. So then the different classes, the bars are becoming more and more diverse. So there is an increase in the variability of the wood in the river. So then we also wanted to know how far the wood traveled. And so for the pieces that we tracked and could find after the floods, here we plotted the probability of travel a certain transport distance. And so in general, we see that the probability to travel very long distances, so distances longer than 1 kilometer, remain very low. However, if we include in the analysis the pieces that we could not find, and we assume they traveled downstream from the studied ridge, then the probability increases quite a lot. And we see that distances longer than 2 kilometers are still not that low. What we also see is that the transport distance was not always related to the magnitude and the duration of the flood. And you can see this better in this graph. So in this graph, you see the number of pieces that moved versus the peak discharge of the different floods, and the size of the marker shows the median transport distance. And so first we can see that the transport of wood is a non-linear process, and also that the different floods that were very similar in the peak discharge moved the pieces very different distances, and also a very different number of pieces were actually moving. So this is the relation with the peak discharge. However, the duration of the flood seems to be more important to remobilize the wood. So we wanted also to understand the fluxes. So during the floods, what is the rate of the wood transport? So in this graph, you have the hydrograph of the flood in blue. So this charts versus time, and then the number of pieces that were passing by a certain section of the river. So what you can see is that most of the wood was transported at the very beginning of the flood, so during the rising limb and during the peak. And then there is no much transport afterwards during the falling limb. And this shows a clockwise hysteresis loop, as has been also observed for sediment transport. And so if we compare to the following flood, so these were 2 consecutive floods that happened in the same year. Although the second flood had almost twice the discharge of the first one, we can see that wood was wood transport was much less important during the second one. And so this is also because in between these two floods, there was no additional wood recruitment. So all the pieces that were in the river and were available to move during the flood were already transported during the first flood, and only some remaining pieces were mobilized during the second one. So this clearly shows that the flood history and wood availability are key. And so these floods also gave us a unique opportunity of tracking and monitoring the wood during the floods. And to do so, we combined several drones and we tracked the pieces of wood applying this machine learning algorithm that I showed you before. And so when doing that we could analyze in detail, for example, the trajectories of the wood, but also, as you will see in this video, how the wood is rotating, how is interacting with the river banks, with the river bars, and with other pieces. So this is still data that we are analyzing, but this will give us wood trajectories, the wood velocity. We can compute the drag forces, the rotation. And so this hopefully will give us a very interesting information about the motion of wood during floods. So the last part of the talk is related to the hazards associated to the transport of wood. And so to do this, we apply or we use a numerical model. And so to explore wood transport, we developed some years ago a numerical model that couples the hydraulics and the in-stream wood transport. So the model is called EverWood. Ever solves the two-dimensional shallow water equations, the Sandvenand equations, and applies the classical sediment transport equations for bed load and suspended load. And Everwood couples or includes a Lagrangian approach, which simulates individual pieces of wood with and without roots as discrete elements in the domain. So this model was developed and validated using data from flume experiments, but also data from the field. So now in this work, we use it for reconstructing a flood. So in this case was a flood that affected the Francolí River in the northern part of Spain in 2019. And as you can see in this picture, although the quality is not very high, it caused severe damages across the river, also with large quantities of wood entrained and transported, and several bridges blocked and damaged. So we wanted to reproduce or reconstruct the flood because the only gouging station installed in the river was, of course, damaged during this event. So we didn't we couldn't find information on the flood hydrograph or discharge, and also there was no information about the wood transport or sediment transport. So we did a post-event survey and compared the field observations with the model results, paying particular attention to the bridges that were most affected. And so we simulated several scenarios with different hydrographs with and without sediment and wood transport. And we have the reference of this bridge that we know it was overtopped. So together with other high water marks, we reconstructed the most probable scenario. And so in this graph, you have the water depth or the cumulative distribution functions of water depth for the different scenarios that we modeled. we had 3 different hydrographs, only water, with different peak discharges, and then other scenarios with the same hydrographs, but also including sediment transport and wood transport. And what you can see in the graph is that only the scenarios with sediment and wood gave us enough water for the flood to overtop the bridge. So the absence of sediment and wood or the presence of sediment and wood could explain the impacts of the flood better than even a higher discharge. And we could also explore in detail the water depth and flow velocity fields and the erosion and sedimentation. So as you see in these images here, the flood and the blockage of this bridge caused extremely high flow velocities and also very important erosion and sedimentation. And the model also reproduced the deposits of wood, not only in this bridge, but along the studied bridge. This is what you see in this map. So the model reproduced the depositional patterns. And as we simulated an unsteady flood, so a hydrograph, we could also reproduce the clogging process in this bridge. So in these figures here, you have the trajectories of the wood simulated by the model. These are the color bars. And so you see that the first picture on the left shows the very beginning of the clogging process. So a lot of pieces of wood are being deposited upstream from the bridge. So the flow goes from left to right. And then at certain point along the hydrograph, the bridge is blocked, is clogged by this wood. But also afterwards, this accumulation of wood bridge and releases suddenly a lot of pieces of wood and also increases the erosion and the transport capacity of the flow. So this clogging process that was only speculated to happen during the flood, we were able to reproduce and to explore more in detail with the numerical model. And this process significantly affected the river reach downstream from this bridge. So it was very relevant to understand what happened. So what is very important in terms of flood hazards and wood transport is identifying the bridges that might be prone to trapping wood. And this is what we did using a database from different rivers in the UK. So we collected 49 information of 49 bridges across the UK, for which we had information or we had data about the history of wood trapping. And then we compiled variables related to the bridge geometry, so the number of piers, the geometry of the piers, the bridge span, but also characteristics of the catchments or the forested area and the channel morphology, for example, the slope, the channel width. And with this information, we trained a decision tree algorithm, splitting the data into training and testing. And this decision tree identified the bridges that were prone to wood trapping and bridges that were not prone to wood trapping. And the prediction efficiency for the testing subset was 60%, which was very encouraging. So we decided to test the model in the Francolí River, the river I showed you before, located in Spain, that was affected by this flood a few years ago. And so here we built a similar database. So there were 23 bridges along the 30 kilometers river reach that was affected by the flood. And with this data, we applied the exact same decision tree that we trained with the data from the UK. And the model successfully identified 60% of the most affected bridges as prone to accumulate wood. So now the next step is to combine these two data sets and obtain an improved and more efficient decision tree algorithm that might be able to identify bridges prone to trapping wood in a more general manner. So when we combined the two data sets and trained a new algorithm, we obtained efficiencies of about 80%. And also, if we look in detail to the confusion matrix, so the errors of this model, we see that the model only failed in one case to identify a wood-prone bridge. Still, this database is small and limited to the bridges that we had data from. So we would like to continue this work and expanding the database, and we are now developing a random forest algorithm with multiple trees that hopefully will be more efficient and can be generalized to any bridge or any river. So just some take-home messages to finish. In the first one is that instream large wood is a natural and functional component of healthy river ecosystems, and it is as important as the flow, the sediment, and vegetation. And the wood regime is a very valuable framework for assessing and managing rivers and must be included in our understanding of rivers, but also in the flood hazard assessment. Still further investigation on the sources of large woods or the supply processes, the wood transport is needed. And one key aspect is monitoring. And now we see that monitoring wood with cameras is a very powerful technique. So we could expand this and monitor wood in many rivers. And an important point is that wood in rivers research requires a cross-discipline collaboration. So you have seen that we combine very different techniques. So it's important also this multidisciplinary approach. And with this, I thank you for your attention and will be happy to answer your questions.
Thanks a lot, Virginia, for your talk. That was a really, really great talk and very interesting case studies. So now the chat is open for questions. And while everyone is thinking of writing a question, I would like to take a quick, very general question about how big or small are the pieces of wood when you're quantifying them in terms of wood count?
Yeah, that's important. So there is a standardized size that to be considered large wood, the pieces should be longer than 1 meter and thicker than 10 centimeters in diameter. And so we try to focus on pieces that are larger than this, but it's true that during floods, many small pieces are transported, but they contribute very little to the total volume of wood. So all the more abundant, they are not so important. So we try to neglect them.
Yeah. Okay. And just to continue that question, because it's interesting, is that, and when you're quantifying this wood, does it differ, whether you're towards where it's just the flood has just started towards the end? Does it vary because pieces of wood might break down? So the quantifying value would vary at the beginning of the catchment towards the end or something like that?
Yeah, that's also a very good question and something that has not been studied much. So the breakage of wood during floods, also for the study site that I showed you today, the Spoel, this is a relatively small river and relatively small floods. But it's true that during more extreme events, and especially in larger rivers, wood may break during its transport. So it could be an important process, but this has not been quantified as far as I know. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So we do have a question in the chat, and maybe Yue, you want to take that question from the chat?
Yeah. Okay. So the question is from Luca. So the question is regarding the mobilization of wood of different size at a similar peak flood discharge. It might be on the slide 24. So Luca asks, is this linked to a critical discharge beyond which the coarse bedrock become mobile and freeze wood? Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So this is also something that we would like to explore more. So the threshold, the discharge threshold for wood to start moving is related to the previous flood that transported and deposited the wood. But of course, for wood that is varied, this threshold may be related to the threshold for bed load. And so in the Spol, we have several sites where we observe pieces of wood being buried and then released after the flood. So we would like to explore this more in detail. Yes, but this is an indeed very interesting question. Thanks.
Okay. It seems like we also have another question here. Daniel Scott says, thanks for the excellent talk, Virginia. From a practical standpoint, I'm wondering about the effort required to set up and run Eberwood for a bridge like the one you showed on slide 30, compared to just setting up and running a hydrodynamic model. Could you give a rough estimate of how much more time it took to set up the model that included wood as well? Rough estimate is fine, 2 times as long, 10 times, 100 times.
Yeah, that's a very good question also. So I think the most demanding in terms of time is setting up the hydraulic, also the input data for any hydraulic model. So to get the topography for the calculation mesh. And in this case, the geometry of the bridge is very important. So whether you add wood or not to the simulation, this requires some time. And this is, in my opinion, the most demanding task. Then the addition of wood depends on the data that is available. You can always design different scenarios. So adding wood to the model itself requires 5 minutes, 10 minutes, if you have the data already, or if you have designed the input wood in advance. So the model itself is relatively user-friendly. Another question is the computational time, which of course, if you simulate both sediment and wood transport, increases significantly. Nowadays, EVER is parallelized for hydrodynamics and morphodynamics, and wood transport is being parallelized as well. So in hopefully not very long, the computational time will be reduced. But now for a river like this, and I can also tell you a river network that we are simulating now, 30 kilometers with several tributaries with flow and wood, takes between 3 and 5 days to run for a very long hydrograph. This model here, the Francolli, which was, I think, a few kilometers long with 2 bridges, morphodynamics, hydrodynamics, and wood, took also between 2 and 3 days in a regular laptop.
Okay, thank you. And for now, there are no questions. But does anybody else have any questions? Okay, we can wait for a couple of minutes if there are a few questions. But just as just a question about the hazards associated with bridges, when you're quantifying, wood transport and hazards related to bridge clogging, are there like certain types of bridges where you see? Because I mean, bridges would be very, very different, small ones, big ones. So do you see that pattern, some sort of a pattern to the types of bridges?
Yes, so we saw this, for example, in the decision tree. One important bridge characteristic is the number of piers within the channel. So then the more piers, the higher, let's say, susceptibility to trap wood. The shape of the bridge pier we have observed also with flume experiments and with numerical modeling that may influence the probability to trap the wood in transport. And then, of course, the span, so the width and the freeboard, the height of the bridge are very important. Yes, so the geometry, that's the main, let's say, the main problem is not the wood, it's just the way the structures are designed that are not allowing the wood to pass through.
Okay, thank you. I see there are no more questions. So I think if it's okay for everyone, then we can end this session. We are close to an hour already. So thanks a lot, Virginia. That was a lovely talk. And thank you for accepting to give a talk at Landscape Live. And thank you to everyone who attended the talk as well. So yeah, and there are lots of thank yous in the chat, and I think you'll be able to see those as well. So
thank you. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. All right then. Bye, everyone.